Welcome everyone to the last session of JNUC 2017. It is both exciting and disappointing that I get to end this with you all because it's so much fun to be here at JNUC with all of you. Today the last session of today is what it says on the tin. Miles couldn't choose a longer title for me to announce, so I am making fun of you, I'm sorry. Or use products in the manner with their labeling. So with me today, Miles, a former coworker of mine, and he's going to talk about the title, which is leaving a lot of people in question. So, Miles, with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Kyle. So we have what it says on the tin, or use products in a manner consistent with their labeling. And really what I want to get into here is the Apple way of doing things, why we ought to do things that way, cases where we will be tempted or maybe even have to deviate from that, and what the pitfalls might be, as well as sort of a walk through my own journey of learning how to do these things and figuring out these pitfalls and so forth. So that said, this is me, right? You've probably seen me once or twice this week. And I've been doing this stuff for a long, long time. And this is where I'm currently doing my stuff. So going into the journey, just kind of where I've been, how I've come up with a lot of these concepts and practices. Right, we don't even really need to talk about this stuff, right? This really doesn't matter anymore. I mean, some people tell you the Windows stuff matters, but whatever. So, come around 2002, right, really got into the Unix, right? In fact, at this point in time, Apple was talking about Unix a lot. They're like, hey, this Mac OS X thing, it's got Unix underneath, and look at all the cool stuff you can do. And so we're deploying Jaguar, I was using a tool called Radmind. Show of hands, who's ever touched some Radmind? Love it. Love it. That's about half the room. That's awesome. And Radmind was awesome, but how many of you that used Radmind were able to take a vacation ever? Yeah, not me either. That was just a prompt. iHook, again, another tool that lets you do login hooks, but this was very techie and Unix nerd intensive, right? So we got to do a lot of cool stuff. We got to control the system in ways that made IT happy, and if we were doing it really well, that made the users happy. But we were constantly iterating it, constantly coding and digging into the Unix. So, you know, good and bad there. Then the next year, we get some more capabilities, right? We have Panther, we have MCX. MCX was lovely, right? We got to go in there and say, oh, look, there's a checkbox in the GUI, there's a key we could set, and this is awesome magic, right? Binding to Active Directory, which was both cool and a nightmare, and kind of still is, both of those things. We're getting in there, and we're getting more capabilities, and we're still in a spot where these tools are very young, right? And Apple is still kind of feeling it out. We're all still feeling it out. And we're really still being asked to treat the Mac as if it were a Windows box, right? So a lot of these MCX keys that were first coming out were geared towards setting some settings that the Windows admins expect to be able to set, right? Move on to 2004, we're making some more Microsoft people happy. All right, so we've got our golden triangle. We've got more MCX stuff, right? Who deployed a golden triangle? How much beer was involved, right? So again, it was good for the time, and it gave us more capabilities. And we got more out of MCX this year, and Tiger was leaps and bounds beyond what came before. So as we're digging into this stuff, we're learning more and more about how to manage this Mac, right? And those of us who'd come in from those earlier, you know, System 6, System 7, yada, yada, early pre-OS 10 days, Like, yeah, this is great. We can manage a lot of stuff. And so some of us might start really feeling that power. And then we start falling into some pitfalls, right? So look at all this Unix. I can control everything, and I'm going to, right? So then, that's cool, right? I can create custom scripts. We can go ahead and use Bash. We can pull stuff from servers. We can deploy oddball software. We've got Homebrew and Mac ports and all this great stuff, and making all the Unix folks happy, but kind of making a mess on those disks, right? And we can hack into app and system settings. We start doing stuff like GUI scripting. It's like, oh yeah, well, I can't set a key, but I can tell the mouse to go click this thing over here, right? Which was great until somebody blew on the keyboard, right? So, again, good and bad. And so this is around the point where I came away from those open source pieces and started writing my own custom scripts, where the methodology, you know, as Jamf customers, you might recognize, right? There was a web server, and the client would go talk to the web server periodically, and it would download a package or run a script. And I was maintaining all this myself, which was very labor intensive, okay? Which is where I ended up in 2006. What am I doing, right? I've built all this custom stuff, right, far beyond Radmine, because with Radmine you have a community. At least there's some people who know what's going on, right? When you write it all yourself, it's you, right? So again, I can't take a vacation. I can't do anything, and my boss is not going to let me hire a whole bunch of clones of me, right? So I really start looking for better options at this point, and that's where I come to Macworld when that was still a thing out in San Francisco, and I saw this kind of cool, kind of weird dude, Zach, talking about this Casper Suite thing, and I'm like, hey, that's kind of the methodology I'm using, but instead of maintaining all these scripts and teaching people how to use them, I give him some budget, and he gives me his software and some documentation and some training. Awesome, right? So this is where, as it says on the slide, right, we realize sometimes budget is greater than bandwidth, right? We don't have the ability to hire all these dudes or, you know, whatever pronoun you want to use for yourself. And we instead buy some stuff, right? It's going to let us automate. So there's a couple of different products out there. You might recognize some of these. I'm not going to go into exactly what they all do. If you're not sure, feel free to Google them if you like. Hopefully you're not using them anymore, with the exception of the top one. So that's where we're at, buying back time. So then, this is where I kind of have a break in my story. So I went and worked for Jamf Software for a few years. So I learned a few things there, and I got to meet all you people, right? And one of my favorite things about coming to JNUC now is meeting all the folks that I've worked with in the past, and really appreciate you guys, because folks will come up to me and say, hey, I learned this from you. I learned many, many more things from you guys. And working for Jamf gave me the opportunity to touch every type of organization in the world, from like a 5-seat mom and pop shop somewhere up to some of the biggest organizations on the planet, from corporate, education, higher ed, government, both out US and others, right? So just picked up a broad range of experience here, learning what works and what doesn't in different environments. So then time came to move on from Jamf, and so now I'm taking all that stuff that I've learned over my admin life and my Jamf life, and we're passing that on, right? So what do we need to do? What do we need to do as admins? Well, Jamf Pro, right? The Apple management tool. And I know I'm not fishing for applause here, this is a Jamf conference. But I did my due diligence before I bought the thing the first time around back in 2007. And I've done my due diligence every year since. And every year, Jamf is the thing to buy and re-up, okay? If anybody wants to talk to me more about that, I'd be happy to offline. Apple has now got the MDM and Apple deployment programs, right? These things allow us to control, configure, and get content onto these devices, right? These are built by Apple. We don't have to worry about it, right, as if we're pulling the content from Apple. Data backup and restore, right? This is an important piece, right, because a lot of what gets talked about, say in last year's IBM presentation, a few other presentations you'll see here and at other conferences, is a zero-touch model, right, where you want to hand somebody a shrink-wrapped box, a shrink-wrapped Mac, and say, you're going to take off and start using this thing, right? We'll use DEP, we'll get you enrolled, we'll get your stuff configured. But that's great the first time you run into this employee or other person in your organization. But what happens when you need to replace their computer, right? What's our data policy? A lot of organizations will say, well, we don't have one, it's up to the user. And that's not super user-friendly, right? There's a lot of good tools out there. There's at least 2 of them that were here at the conference this week. I urge you to take a look at this product category because that is a key component of getting your zero touch off the ground, right? You're never going to get to a true zero touch unless you're doing something with users' data, okay? And then the last piece here is question everything regularly, right? And what I mean by that is we all, as Mac admins, as Apple admins, run into scenarios where we're given a requirement that to us makes no sense, right? It was something that was written, you know, last year, 10 years ago, 30 years ago for a different platform, right? So we need to open up these conversations, make relationships if we need to with the stakeholders. So security teams, internal application teams. We need to get friendly with those folks, have dialogue with them, and understand what their needs are, and how can we get them the information they need to meet those needs on the Apple platform and on an Apple platform that's rapidly changing, right? So one thing that I do and that I recommend anybody else do is anytime we decide on a policy, a program, a thing that we're doing, that gets a review period baked into it. Now, it may vary depending on what that thing is, but we'll say, okay, this is the decision today, and we're going to review this in 90 days, or maybe 120 days. But there's always a review period coming up. You know, notifications go into people's calendars, and we're going to talk about it again at the end of that period and say, does this still make sense? So we don't end up back in the same position later, right? The next piece, and we're done kind of with my journey here, getting into some just basic concepts, again, things that we've learned. And it's Apple's world. We're just living in it, right? We don't decide how these devices work. When we try to, we give ourselves headaches and ulcers, and we annoy our users, and stuff just doesn't work, right? Unless we are able to employ armies of developers that are going to reinvent every wheel every time there's an update to everything, right? So I don't know about you, I don't have that kind of budget. So Apple designs that technology to work in a certain way, as we say. We want to use it. We don't want to jam the square peg into the round hole, right? We want to figure out why is the hole round, and how can we make our approach round? And forgive me for burying myself in the metaphor there. So one thing I think of when I'm having a chat with another admin is when you try to reinvent a wheel, right? You're using a product improperly, right? Now I know this is an international audience, but I believe this translates, it might not be the same number, but this translates across a lot of countries that I've seen, right? U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, Title 40. So this is what's responsible for that little label that you'll see on cleaning products in the U.S., where it says it's a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling, right? So it's not just the law, it's a good idea. If you use your cleaning products irresponsibly and against vendor recommendations, you can cause health or property damage. If you use computers irresponsibly and against vendor recommendations, you can cause revenue and organizational damage. Okay? So this is kind of a guiding principle I keep, and I always think of this label when somebody asks me to do something that goes against the vendor. Okay? The other thing to keep in mind, Apple's R&D budget last year was $10 billion. Only the 283 top companies that Fortune rank made more money than that. Never mind spent more money than that. There's only 283 companies on the planet that made more money than that last year. Can you out-engineer that? What's your engineering budget, right? So I look at that and I say, if I'm going to look at the minds at Apple, and this is not to say they're always right, but they're more likely to be right than I am, right? So I look at Cupertino and all the effort and money that they spend and realize that it would be an exercise in hubris to believe that I know more than they know, right? Another great thing we've got going on here, we have Mac OS and iOS convergence, right? So this is, maybe we'll never get to 100%, but we've seen over the past several years how components from iOS are coming into Mac OS. And we've seen entitlements, firmware, APFS, system integrity protection. There's rumors all the time that more and more iOS stuff is coming into Mac OS, and I believe it, right? I don't know which ones are true, but I'm sure next year there's going to be something, right? There's going to be a little more iOS in Mac OS. And that's great, because iOS is probably the most secure computing platform I've ever seen, right? And we all want that, right? So, but there seems to be a trade-off, and maybe that balance tips over time where we get that security, but we get fewer admin options. And so part of that is we need to go to Apple with our feedback, and part of it is we need to rethink our, quote, needs, right? So are they still needs, right? Going back to that constant review concept. Are they needs on this platform, right? So the next thing I want to point out, which used to be a pretty controversial conversation, and now there are a lot fewer people who will argue with the point, right? So imaging. Some say imaging is dead. It's getting there, right? So it's not dead, but it is on borrowed time. Not impossible, very impractical at this point, okay? At the moment, there have been a few articles published about this in the past few months. The firmware updates that are required for current Macs. There is only one entity that has the system entitlements to install them, and that is the Mac OS installer. Right, so you can dig into and reverse engineer and pull out firmware update packages to your heart's content. You cannot install them. The installer must do it, right? So if you're going to image, and you can glean all this out of ASR man pages and various other bits that have been published, but what it boils down to is you're going to require a whole lot of DMGs, right? So at the moment, with the current Macs on the market, you can create an image for the MacBook Pro with Touch Bar late 2016 13-inch, right? You're going to want to create that image after you've run the installer, gotten all the firmware updates in place, right? And then let's say you're going to install the currently available version of Mac OS, 10.13, and that is now an image that you can use on other MacBook Pro with Touch Bar late 2016 13-inch. Not the 15-inch, not without the Touch Bar, and not a different version, right? So you're not going to be able to apply that image to a computer that's running Sierra, right? Or a computer that had previously been updated to 10.13.1, for example, right? Once 10.13.1 comes out, now you need that permutation of NDMGs is n Mac models, right? Each and every individual model times n OS versions. It's a whole lot of images in order to cling to a dying process. Okay, so there's my recommendation there in the bottom of the slide. Pull the plug. It's over. Imaging is done. Okay. The next thing we need to be on top of, and this is for ourselves and for all of our partners in our organizations, is continuous learning. We talk about this in a lot of different contexts. We need to bring this Apple knowledge to our security teams, to our internal developers, to our network teams. They need to know how these products work, right? Because most of them in any organization that's more than a few years old are probably used to doing things a certain way, and that's probably a Microsoft way or a Cisco way or not an Apple way, right? So we want to make sure that they get on board with the continuous learning along with us, right? Because, you know, how many of us spend a ton of time sitting in conference rooms trying to explain to network engineers or security engineers how this all works, right? Almost all of us, I would assume. So rather than doing that, we need to impress upon these folks the fact that we have this platform in our organization and they're providing a service to it. So they need to learn how to do that, right? So all of these different pieces, of course, Apple's, the top 3 items are, you know, Apple's programs, conferences like this one and a lot of the other great ones out there, the community, so both walking around the halls here at conferences like this, the Mac Admin Slack, all kinds of blogs out there. Charles Edge keeps a nice list of these different resources on cryptid.com, so I encourage you to take a look at that. But the point being, we got to stay engaged, right? We have to make sure that we're continually learning and encouraging our partners to do the same. We're going to have constant change, right? Don't just sign up for these programs, use them, right? Create a project to, once Developers Conference comes along, all right, you take that new developer preview of the next OS and you get it in a lab. You start banging on it with your organization's workflows, seeing which third-party vendors need to update their products to adhere to the current Apple paradigm. So we need to get in there and get this intelligence for ourselves and make sure our vendors are helping us out. This is a philosophical piece, right? This kind of actually annoys me a little bit, to be honest, right? When I look out at the community and there's a new thing that Apple put out there in the world, and the first question is, how do I turn it off, right? Not how do I use it, not what is this good for, but how do I not use it? And that just, I love technology, that's why I do this, and that just kind of turns me off a little bit, right? Why wouldn't I try to figure out how to do the thing? What's Apple trying to get at here? And is this going to help us out and make our lives and our users' lives better? Okay. So again, challenging assumptions and the way we've always done it. So in every organization I've been in at least the last 8 years, I always challenge the way we've always done it. In fact, I will go into meetings and somebody will say, well, this is how it has to be. This is the way it's always been. This will never work here. And I will then rattle off a list of all the things that will never work that I've done, right? We've all done those things, right? And we need to keep doing those things. So we talk about education. We talk about keeping up with the environment, keeping current with the community. But there are going to come points where there's something missing, right? There's, for example, there's a lot of conversations, right? Jamf's making some good features into the product around patching, right? But Jamf will tell you that it's not quite what they want to deliver, right? It's not quite what we all need. It's getting there. But that's an opportunity, right? Where there's a lot of open source, third-party stuff that's filling in that space. But that's filling a gap. Don't reinvent the wheel, right? I might try to build a patch mechanism to supplement what Jamf is giving me, but I'm not going to try to rewrite how APNS works, right? And I've talked to people who try to do that. doesn't work well for them. Okay? So adopt the tools that the vendor provides. And there's a lot of great and clever folks out here in the world and out here in our own community. And they create these very clever projects. Some of them are reinventing a wheel. Some of them are filling a gap, right? I'm more interested in the latter. Okay. So again, where Apple provides a solution, use it. And then finally, regardless of what you're using, if it's open source, if it's from Apple, if it's from Jamf, provide feedback, file radars with Apple, right? If something doesn't meet your needs, it's not going to get any better if you don't tell anybody about it. And complaining on Slack isn't really telling anybody about it, right? Vendors have channels. You got to use their channels to get that feedback heard. So to that, I kind of look at the cautionary tale of the Xserve, right? The Xserve died because nobody bought it, right? It wasn't a terrible product. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a terrible product, but nobody bought the thing, right? And so, of course, Apple's in the business to make money. So if nobody's buying the thing, why are they going to keep selling it, right? So maybe it had some flaws, but if that Xserve had a large and vocal user base that was buying a ton of Xserves and submitting tons of radars, it might still be around today, right? So that's the cautionary tale of the Xserve. If you've got a thing that kind of does what you want, give your feedback and use it and work around it, fill the gaps if you need to. Of course, if we try to reinvent a wheel, right, we have to support it. Our organization has to support it when we're gone, right? So at that company years ago, where I essentially wrote my own Casper suite, they were out of luck when I left, right? And that's not cool, right? I consider that a failure on my part, sorry. So we want to make sure that we're not doing wrong to the folks that are paying our bills, right? So if we go against Apple's methods, it will break, and it will break often. And this is something that we talk to our third-party vendors about, right? So if, and I pick Microsoft because they're the first one that comes to mind, but just disclaimer, Microsoft is very good lately. They follow the rules almost entirely and almost at all times. But they weren't always that way, right? So I'm sure we all remember Word might do a thing in its coding that Apple says you shouldn't do in the OS, right? And so then the perception from a lot of folks is, oh, well, Apple broke Word. No. Microsoft didn't follow the rules in that case, right? Microsoft knows what the rules of the platform are, and in that old version of Word, they didn't code it appropriately to fit within those rules, right? So Microsoft is much better. Their stuff works great now, but there's a lot of vendors that still use that mode, right? And so those are the vendors that we need to lean on. And those of us that don't work for enormous organizations that can scare a vendor by saying we're going to buy something else, we band together into these communities and tell them your stuff is not good. Please make it better, or we're going to go look for something else. Okay. So, again, if I'm reinventing the wheel, I need to re-engineer it every year, right? Apple's introducing changes to the OS every single year. And I'm going to need to rebuild and, at the very least, heavily test any of my scratch-built stuff. And if that stuff is reinventing a wheel, to me, that's wasted effort yet again, right? Because it's already there. There's already a way to do it. The next piece is everything that we deploy must positively contribute to the user experience, right? And this is conversations that we have typically with outside stakeholders, security teams, network teams, and so forth, where they'll ask us to deploy an antivirus product. They'll ask us to deploy a VPN product. And a lot of these products don't adhere to Apple rules, right? So what we do is we need to ask these questions, and we need to set this up. We need to set up this review, right? I'm sure whenever you decide as the person in charge of your Apple deployment that you need to do a thing in your organization, there's some reviews you got to go through, right? Somebody's going to ask questions. You might need to fill in some bureaucratic paperwork and sit in front of a board. And we need to do that for our platform, right? We are the custodians of the Apple platform. So we need to have that same sort of gatekeeping to say, if we're going to let this thing into the environment, is it going to break the OS first and foremost? If it's yes, that's a non-starter. Go away, come back later, right? Fix it. Does it provide a real benefit? So there are conversations in a lot of organizations about, and I'm just using this as an example, antivirus, right? So Apple's got a lot of malware protection built into Mac OS, and as an example, and again, I don't want to go too deep into the pros and cons there, but there's certainly an argument to be made, if not everyone agrees on what the outcome of that argument is. But there's an argument to be made that you don't need that third-party antivirus, right? Because you're satisfying the requirement with something else, with some of the built-in tools. So that's point two, right? If this thing isn't going to provide a real benefit, it isn't going to contribute to proper operation of the system and potentially damage it, again, why do I need it? Right? Does it duplicate built-in functionality? I consider that sort of, again, a no-brainer. Sometimes you won't win that argument, right? Somebody might want Word end pages, right? Somebody might want, 4 different things to do the same task. And ultimately, maybe that's okay, right? Maybe different departments have different workflows and different ways of doing things, as long as the item meets all your other requirements, right? And then finally, is there an Apple way, right? And so coming back to that antivirus conversation, there is, right? Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk to Apple. Let's get the security folks in the room and say, does this solve your problem, right? Maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't, but we want to at least have that conversation. So the other piece here is when we say bad requirements, it's subjective. I don't like to assume anybody's intentionally silly, right? So we look at these lists of requirements, and every one of them was probably a really good idea at a certain time in a certain context, right? And that comes back to the constant review. But that constant review is where we identify the now bad requirement, and we can apply our reason and our reasoning to these points against it. So I want to offer you a little bit of hope here. It can be done, right? We come to conferences like this, and we're constantly hearing about folks who are doing it, right? A bunch of different organizations that I won't name right now, right, big and small, are deploying tons of Macs as Apple intends them to be deployed at enormous scale, right? So it is being done. We're getting this all done. And you can too. Engaging with the community, engaging with your resources is going to help you get there. And to that point, that's the end of my prepared remarks. If anybody has questions, happy to take them.
All right, first volunteer.
Is I've actually been only doing this for about a year, the Mac side of things. I've been a Windows guy for forever, and we just started deploying Macs about this time last year, a little earlier. And I'm running into that. We shouldn't be doing this just because that's how we do it in Windows, right? But getting people to buy into that has been very difficult. I mean, do you have any general strategies on how to kind of build those relationships, build your communications so you can effectively persuade?
Sure. And so this is a big challenge for a lot of us. And this is not to knock anybody. I put myself firmly in this category. We nerds are not always the best at social interaction, right? So there's a lot of social lubricant available, right? A box of donuts, a case of beer, right? Go to these people, get friendly with them, talk to them about, do they like hunting? Do they like cars? Do they, get to know them as a person and sort of start that dialogue going. Make them understand that you're a person and you're part of their organization. They're trying to ultimately meet the same goals you are, right? Which is to provide a serviceable platform for the users, right? So that's the best social advice I can offer. But once you're actually talking to these people as fellow humans, then you can bring it up and say, hey, we've got this problem. We need to have this security thing, but what's the core requirement, right? You're telling me to deploy product X, but that doesn't make sense on this platform, right? Why do you deploy product X? And what problem are you trying to solve with it? And then we can go and talk to Apple and say, how do you solve this problem? Or maybe some Mac-focused vendors and say, do you have a solution for this problem?
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
All right, other questions, comments, challenges?
So this isn't a question directly for you, but it is one that came up as you were doing your presentation, and maybe more of a forum question. What is everyone else using for DLP, or data loss prevention? Because some of the products I have deployed break macOS very well, and I haven't found one that doesn't do that.
Okay. I'll venture an answer, and then if we want to have anybody else pipe up, we're welcome to, or we're happy to hear it, but you might want to come up to the mic if you have a comment. So what I'll say is, as far as DLP goes, the ones I find to be top in the running, so to speak, would be ones that operate on a network level. There are certain products, actually there's a few organizations here this week that have DLP features in their product, and those are mostly the backup vendors that were here. But with DLP and Apple devices, generally speaking, I want to trust Apple that they're securing the device, and I don't want to mess with that security, right, so that I can trust it. But I want to know where the data is going, right, when it leaves the device. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Any other?
If you have ideas or comments to that, please come to the mic so everyone can hear you.
Yeah, the product we used at the Federal Reserve for DLP was Digital Guardian, which runs as a kernel extension, very low level. And it can track if you copy a certain email address into text or anything that leaves the computer.
Okay. And just, I want to address, there was some giggling in the room there, and for anybody who's not aware, in macOS High Sierra, there's, I forget what the current iteration, I know Skell is old naming, sorry? Ukulele, yes, or whatever the actual letters are, which I don't recall off the top of my head, but basically secure kernel extension loading. This is a direction that clearly Apple wants to go in. It's a direction that a lot of security folks agree with. So I would look to vendors like that are providing a great solution to ask them, how are you going to provide this when you don't have a kernel extension, right? And not as a gotcha, but as a true question, right? How can we solve this problem? Cool.
So I got a question about your argument about using XProtect in the built-in versus antivirus. What do you do to convince your security team that XProtect is good when Apple doesn't go, they don't go out of their way to publish what they're blocking and what definitions they're pumping out?
Mm-hmm. I will say it is no secret that those of us in the community would love more information out of Apple. I see Apple making moves in that direction in certain places. I haven't seen anything in that way yet. But it's something to ask for, right? Send your feedback to your Apple reps. I certainly would love to see that, some more details on what exactly is being protected against. You can do some reporting in the JSS, right? There's some data that you can query on the device.
And we're querying the XML file that the XProtect feed shows, and we can see it in our JSS, but it would be nice to have a publicly available Apple saying, you know, we're blocking these things.
Absolutely. That would be great. And I believe it's feedback.apple.com.
Yep.
So I don't even work for Apple. Right.
All right, thanks.
Cool.
You again.
Yep.
That just kind of spawned a question for me, and maybe someone else might know too, but my question with that, on that subject is, has any third-party vendor proven that they do anything that Apple doesn't?
That is a great question. That I don't have an answer for it, but that is a great question to ask the vendor.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're being asked to use a product, bring their engineers in and say, what value are you bringing? Right? What's better about your product than what Apple provides?
Yeah.
I'll add an answer. So one of the things that we've asked our folks that manage our antivirus is to provide us reports about what they're detecting on the Mac and let us know. And so we look at that and we don't see them finding anything except maybe some word macro that doesn't do anything on a Mac anyway. And so that is good information to have. Another thing that's good to look at is when there's some new malware that comes out for the Mac, go see what your antivirus vendor is doing about it. Are they there? Are they ready? Because XProtect is.
Right.
Are they ready? And that's, just take that back every time when you see that it's not.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Any other comments, questions? Cool.
I'll add to that. For anyone that heard Fletcher Previn's presentation last year, when they did their evaluation and they said Symantec actually caused more issues than they actually stopped. So that's something that you can take back to your security team and say, hey, this is actually costing us money. And IBM makes it an optional install, and it's only a client requirement if the customer that they're working with installs it. It requires it. So that's just something to take back to your team. XProtect is plenty to protect you.
Mm-hmm.
They were supposed to make that available like 2 years ago, and they still haven't.
So
But that was something that was talked about in his presentation last year.
if you go to some of the recordings that are posted out online, you can see some of the slides. They don't have a white paper or anything like that, or a discrete document. But if you review the presentations online, you'll see them talking about that.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely true. And what I look at too is you may have a vendor or a customer requirement that says you must have antivirus to comply with this thing. How about you get your security team to say, well, XProtect is our antivirus solution, right? We have it.
I just add that any security person that I talk to that says they need an antivirus and not anti-malware, immediately that is a red flag for me that they don't understand the current scope of security, because in reality, host intrusion and SSL inspection are going to be much more, viable of actually finding something than some macro virus that you picked up in Word.
Agreed. And this is another thing that I'll bring up as the challenges of being a nerd like us, is we need to understand the conversation we're having sometimes. And sometimes we are having that conversation. It's, well, you're not quite understanding what you're asking for. But other times, we might be having that compliance conversation where they don't care about the technical piece. They just know that we're not going to get this account if we don't have an antivirus thing on our computers. So it helps to frame that conversation, understand what are you really asking for, right? Because a lot of times, we're all nerds in these different departments, and so the socially inept nerd from security will come to the socially inept nerd from Apple management and say, do this thing. And we say, no, that's silly. And we never find out why.
One last question.
Not a question and not an endorsement, but names that I've heard mentioned of possible alternatives are Carbon Black and forgot the other one. See me after.
For which tool, sir?
As an alternative to malware detection and DLP. Yes.
Somebody said cyber reason, I believe. Yep.
So Cybereason, but CrowdStrike was the other one. I haven't used them, don't know, but.
All right. Well, with that, Miles, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Round of applause for Miles. Thanks, sir.